For generations, the people of Nuvia lived beneath layers of rock, steel, and ancient concrete, never once seeing the sky above. Their ancestors had fled to these underground shelters when the surface became a storm of radiation and poison. Over time, stories of the world above turned into distant myths, whispered at night to curious children who would never witness what their elders once did. The concept of sky became as abstract as magic, a fable without proof. Artificial light panels created an imitation of day and night, but no one alive truly understood sunlight. Life underground was all they knew, and anything beyond was considered dangerous fantasy. The sky for them was a forgotten word. The underground city thrived in its own strange way, built on recycled air and ancient technology that few truly understood. Massive filtration systems hummed day and night, purifying and reusing every breath to keep the population alive. Fungal farms and nutrient vats replaced fields and forests, providing the food they needed to survive. The ceilings, lined with soft lights, were programmed to mimic a day cycle that no one had ever experienced firsthand. Entire generations were born and died without seeing more than the artificial glow above their heads. The surface was officially declared uninhabitable centuries ago, and questioning that truth was considered foolish. Exploration was forbidden after the last expedition vanished without a trace. The turning point arrived silently when new signals reached the city's ancient receivers. In orbit, massive ships appeared, descendants of the humans who had once fled the dying Earth. These were terraformers, travelers from the stars carrying technology powerful enough to heal entire planets. Their purpose was to restore what had been lost, to make the poisoned skies breathe again. At first, many underground dismissed it as a trick, a myth layered upon a myth. But soon the broadcasts became undeniable, and their presence above the planet grew clearer each day. The impossible began to sound real. The terraformers started their work by deploying atmospheric processors, giant floating machines that drifted through the dead air like silver clouds. These machines scrubbed toxins from the atmosphere, seeded microscopic life, and repaired what centuries of devastation had broken. High above, the world was being transformed piece by piece, though few underground could see it. Reports from surface sensors began to change in subtle but significant ways. Trace levels of clean oxygen appeared in filtration readings for the first time in living memory. Distant tremors hinted at drilling towers stabilizing the crust. The world above was slowly stirring back to life. At first, daily life underground continued as usual, but hints of change spread like ripples through still water. Scientists noticed shifts in air composition, finding signatures that had been absent for generations. Old archives, long sealed and ignored, were reopened by curious historians hoping to rediscover the lost world. The younger generation, less bound by fear, whispered excitedly about what might lie above. Elders dismissed these talks as dangerous dreams, reminders of past mistakes. Yet something unshakable was growing, a quiet, collective sense of possibility. The surface no longer seemed like a graveyard. It was becoming a mystery that begged to be seen. Not everyone embraced this awakening. The ruling council, whose power was built on the permanence of underground life, saw the terraformers as a direct threat to their control. If the surface became habitable again, their authority would weaken, their structure would crumble. They controlled the flow of information carefully, censoring broadcasts and silencing voices that questioned the official narrative. Rumors circulated about sabotage and secret orders to cut off orbital communications. Those who pushed for transparency often disappeared into quiet reassignment. Fear and hope now coexisted uneasily beneath the ground. Amid this tension, a young historian named Lyra discovered something extraordinary in a forgotten archive. She unearthed an ancient recording, the last sunset captured before her ancestors sealed themselves underground. In it, a brilliant orange sky stretched endlessly, clouds glowing gold as the sun dipped beyond a vast horizon. It was unlike anything she or her peers had ever imagined. The colors, the light, the sheer openness were overwhelming even through the old screen. She watched it repeatedly, captivated by what felt like a message from another world. Quietly, the video spread through hidden channels, igniting imaginations across the city. The terraformers then made an announcement that shook Nuvia's foundations. The atmosphere above had reached breathable levels in limited areas for the first time in centuries. They invited representatives from below to witness the transformation firsthand, to see the restored sky with their own eyes. The council called the idea reckless and forbade anyone from going. But underground whispers grew into plans. Small groups began organizing in secret, determined to ascend through old tunnels that had been sealed for generations. Curiosity had turned into action. Lyra joined a small expedition of scientists and explorers, willing to risk everything to see the sky. They navigated ancient shafts filled with rubble, decay, and forgotten dangers, climbing slowly toward a world none of them had experienced. Every step upward was both exhilarating and terrifying, their hearts pounding with the weight of history. The air grew subtly fresher the higher they climbed, carrying a faint scent unlike anything they had ever known. Their equipment recorded everything, but their minds struggled to comprehend what awaited them. They were no longer just explorers. They were witnesses to the end of an era. Generation after generation had waited for this moment without even knowing it. When they finally reached the surface, the hatch creaked open and blinding light spilled into the tunnel like liquid gold. They stumbled forward, shielding their eyes, unprepared for the vastness above. Stretching endlessly was a pale blue sky, dotted with drifting clouds that seemed to float forever. It was not a myth. It was real, and it was magnificent. Some fell to their knees in silence. Others wept openly as sunlight touched their faces for the first time. In that moment, generations of darkness dissolved, and the forgotten sky returned. The explorers stood in stunned silence, breathing air that was crisp and alive in a way none of them had ever felt. The wind moved across their skin, carrying scents they couldn't identify. Earth, moisture, and something almost electric. The ground beneath their boots was cracked but softening, as if awakening from a long sleep. Above, flocks of engineered birds circled high, released by the terraformers to restore ecological balance. Every direction revealed a landscape caught between ruin and rebirth, skeletal remains of cities entangled with creeping green. For the first time in centuries, they could see horizons stretch beyond imagination. It was beautiful, but it was also daunting. The terraformers greeted them through hovering drones, welcoming them to what they called the renewal zone. These were designated safe regions where the air was breathable, the ground stable, and ecosystems slowly forming again. Massive atmospheric processes floated in the distance, shimmering like metallic clouds, maintaining the delicate balance of this reborn world. Data streamed into the explorers' suits, showing rising oxygen levels and falling toxicity. They walked cautiously, realizing that they were the first of their people to tread here in generations. Every step felt ceremonial, as if they were rewriting history. The world was alive but fragile. In the weeks that followed, temporary camps were established on the surface. The terraformers provided modular shelters that unfolded like flowers, adapting to temperature shifts and radiation levels. Scientists began testing soil samples, searching for signs that the planet could support crops once again. The results were promising. The soil was regenerating, aided by microbial life seeded by orbital drops. Streams once choked with chemicals began to run clear, though cautiously monitored. People worked tirelessly, knowing that these first steps would determine the fate of future generations. It was no longer about survival underground. It was about restoration above. Back in Nuvia, the news of the explorers' success spread in whispers that soon turned into excitement. Secret recordings of the sky made their way through hidden networks, sparking debates and dreams among those still below. Younger generations questioned why they should remain in darkness when light awaited above. Families gathered around smuggled screens, watching the first live transmissions of sunrise. The council struggled to maintain control as curiosity transformed into collective yearning. The surface had become more than a place. It was now a symbol of freedom. The underground world was starting to feel smaller. On the surface, rebuilding was not without challenges. Though the air was breathable, storms occasionally swept through, remnants of the planet's unstable climate. Terraformers warned that these events were part of the natural stabilization process, but they still carried danger. Temporary shelters had to be reinforced, and evacuation protocols were tested repeatedly. Supply lines between the underground city and surface camps were difficult to maintain, requiring old tunnels to be cleared and stabilized. Equipment failed in unpredictable ways, unused to natural conditions. The explorers realized that returning to the surface was not simply stepping into paradise. It was stepping into responsibility. As more teams arrived from below, a new rhythm of life began to form. People woke to the light of dawn rather than artificial panels, marking time by the movement of the sun instead of mechanical cycles. Children ran across open fields for the first time, their laughter echoing against broken buildings overtaken by moss. Fields were cleared for the first experimental crops, blending ancient farming techniques with futuristic tools. Engineers worked to power new infrastructure using wind and solar energy, technologies that thrived in the open air. The transition was overwhelming but exhilarating. Humanity was learning how to live above ground again. The terraformers, observing from orbit and drones, offered guidance but avoided interference in social matters. Their mission was to restore the environment, not dictate civilization's rebirth. They transmitted schematics for sustainable cities designed to coexist with nature rather than dominate it. Circular settlements with green corridors replaced rigid underground grids. Rivers were redirected to nourish growing plains, and seeds for genetically resilient plants were delivered in quiet bursts from orbit. Humanity had been given a clean slate, not perfect, but promising. It was up to those on the surface to decide what kind of world they would build. Tensions still simmered below, where the Council clung to its diminishing power. Some leaders feared losing control over the population if the migration accelerated. Others genuinely worried that the surface was still too unpredictable for mass resettlement. Debates raged in underground halls as surface settlers sent back glowing reports of sunsets and starlight. Some citizens packed their few belongings and joined the ascension groups without permission. Tunnels once meant for escape became pathways to return. The balance of civilization was shifting upward. On the surface, the settlers held their first gathering under the open sky. It was not a formal ceremony, but a spontaneous convergence as people emerged from their shelters to watch the stars together. No one had seen the night sky in generations. The sight left them breathless. Constellations unfamiliar to their ancestors twinkled above, a silent reminder of the universe beyond. Fires crackled softly as people shared stories, blending old myths with their new reality. Hope was no longer an abstract concept. It was tangible, written across the heavens. For the first time, humanity was united by the sky. The terraforming project was far from complete, but a new chapter had begun. The surface was no longer a wasteland, but a living world slowly reclaiming its strength. The people of Nuvia faced enormous work ahead, building homes, growing food, and preserving this fragile balance. Yet there was a sense of purpose, unlike anything underground life had offered. The sky had returned, and with it, a vision of a future shaped by both memory and innovation. Generation by generation, the forgotten world was being reborn. Humanity was learning once again how to live beneath the sun. At first, life on the surface seemed almost miraculous, but the illusion of smooth progress didn't last long. Terraforming had restored the atmosphere, but the climate was still unpredictable and volatile. Sudden storms would appear without warning, drenching settlements in acid rain remnants that hadn't yet been fully neutralized. Winds howled across plains, uprooting temporary shelters and snapping solar towers like twigs. Rivers, still finding their natural courses after centuries of neglect, flooded newly built farmlands overnight. What had once been static underground was now a dynamic world that refused to be controlled easily. Humanity had returned to nature, but nature had its own timetable. The first major setback came when one of the atmospheric processes malfunctioned. It drifted off course, sending a cloud of unprocessed air into a newly settled zone. The air became unstable for several days, forcing hundreds of settlers to retreat underground temporarily. Engineers scrambled to repair the massive machine, but the technology was alien compared to what the underground had maintained for generations. Tensions grew between the terraformers in orbit and the surface settlers, who demanded faster responses and clearer communication. The terraformers explained that the malfunction was expected in early phases, but fear spread quickly. Many began to realize that their survival depended on technology they didn't fully control. Meanwhile, underground, the Council exploited these incidents to regain influence. They broadcast messages, highlighting every surface failure, painting the settlers as reckless idealists risking everyone's future. Fear was a powerful tool, and many older citizens hesitated to leave the safety of the tunnels. Propaganda flooded communal screens, showing edited clips of storms and machine breakdowns to reinforce their warnings. The population became divided between those who believed in rebuilding above and those who clung to tradition below. Migration slowed as uncertainty took root. The dream of returning to the surface began to fracture along generational lines. On the surface, leadership began to splinter as well. Different groups emerged, each with their own vision for how the new society should function. Some advocated for close coordination with the terraformers, embracing their guidance fully. Others insisted on independence, fearing reliance on orbital powers would simply replace underground control with a new authority. Farmers wanted more land for crops, scientists wanted more zones reserved for ecosystem recovery, and engineers wanted priority resources for infrastructure. Arguments escalated into heated disputes as survival priorities clashed with ideological visions. The fragile unity that had defined the first months above began to fray. The environment itself added new complications. As the air grew cleaner, dormant species engineered by the terraformers began to thrive. Some were harmless, like pollinators and grazers, but others were aggressive ecosystem restorers, designed to keep invasive mutations in check. These creatures didn't distinguish between settlers' crops and wild growth, leading to unexpected attacks on food supplies. Protective barriers had to be built quickly, straining limited resources. Scientists warned that these organisms were necessary for long-term ecological stability, but settlers saw them as dangerous intrusions. The balance between human needs and planetary healing became a daily negotiation. As pressures mounted, whispers of abandoning the surface entirely began circulating again. A few families quietly returned underground, unable to handle the unpredictable weather and threats. Their departure sent ripples of doubt through the camps, shaking morale. For others, though, these hardships only deepened their resolve. They argued that their ancestors had built entire cities underground under worse conditions. Surely they could endure storms and creatures above. Town meetings stretched long into the nights as people debated the future of their civilization. The sky overhead, once a symbol of unity, now hung over fractured voices. The terraformers observed these struggles from orbit, but remained firm in their limited involvement. They sent technical fixes and data, but refused to govern surface affairs. They believed humanity had to learn to adapt, not simply inherit a ready-made world. Some settlers grew resentful, accusing them of abandonment after sparking such monumental change. Others admired their restraint, seeing it as a test of human resilience. This divide mirrored older tensions between dependency and independence. The relationship between sky and ground became as complex as the atmosphere itself. Amid the chaos, a new challenge emerged: resource scarcity. The initial supplies from underground were dwindling, and surface-based production wasn't scaling fast enough. Crops suffered from unexpected weather fluctuations, and energy grids struggled to stay stable during intense storms. The settlers had underestimated how long true self-sufficiency would take. Underground, stockpiles remained abundant but tightly controlled by the council, who used this leverage to negotiate power over surface settlements. A delicate, tense trade system formed, linking the old world below with the uncertain one above. Neither side trusted the other fully. Then came an event no one anticipated. A massive storm system, larger than anything recorded since terraforming began, formed on the horizon. Atmospheric models struggled to predict its path, but early signs indicated it was heading directly toward the largest surface settlement. Evacuation plans were hastily prepared, but many feared the shelters wouldn't withstand the storm's force. Terraformers issued urgent advisories from orbit, calling it a residual atmospheric purge, a final violent adjustment as the planet stabilized. For settlers, it was a test of everything they had built so far. The sky that had once given them hope now loomed as their greatest challenge. As the storm approached, settlers, underground citizens, and terraformers found themselves facing a common crisis. For the first time in months, arguments were set aside in favor of collective survival. Engineers worked through the night to fortify shelters. Terraformers rerouted processes to stabilize pressure fronts, and underground teams prepared to receive evacuees. The air crackled with tension as black clouds rolled in, swallowing the horizon. No one knew whether their fledgling society would survive what was coming. The storm was more than a weather event, it was a reckoning. The future of their world depended on how they faced it together. The storm arrived with a force no one alive had ever experienced. Dark clouds devoured the sky, turning day into a furious twilight filled with flashes of electric blue. Winds howled like living things, tearing through the settlements with relentless power. Rain hammered the ground in sheets, carrying traces of old chemicals stirred from the Earth's deep scars. Structures groaned as if protesting against the weight of the tempest. Alarms echoed through camps, guiding people toward reinforced shelters built for emergencies just like this. The sky, once a symbol of hope, now tested the will of everyone who had returned to it. Inside the shelters, fear was palpable. People huddled together, listening to the storm rage outside like an ancient god reclaiming its territory. Engineers monitored pressure gauges and power grids, knowing that a single failure could doom hundreds. Communication lines flickered as winds damaged external arrays, cutting off several outposts from central command. Terraformers from orbit sent real-time data bursts, guiding efforts to stabilize atmospheric processes caught in the storm's path. Underground control centers opened channels to coordinate, something that hadn't happened since the earliest days of terraforming. For the first time in a long time, all factions were focused on survival, not power. On the surface, teams fought to keep critical infrastructure intact despite the chaos. Anchors were deployed to keep floating processors from drifting off course, while solar fields were folded away like metallic petals. Flood barriers groaned, but held as rivers swelled to monstrous proportions. A group of volunteers risked their lives to manually reinforce one of the failing air hubs, crawling through wind and debris with nothing but harnesses and sheer determination. Their actions prevented a catastrophic pressure breach that could have devastated the settlement. Every act of bravery seemed to ripple through the frightened populace, inspiring others to act rather than despair. The storm turned strangers into allies. Underground old divisions began to blur as well. The Council, long accustomed to control, found themselves reliant on surface updates for the first time. Citizens who had once doubted the surface settlers now tuned in to live transmissions, watching them battle the elements with courage. Emergency shelters underground filled with evacuees from the surface, and people who had once dismissed them as reckless welcomed them with open arms. Resource stockpiles were distributed without hesitation, abandoning bureaucratic red tape for immediate aid. It was the first true collaboration between the two worlds in living memory. Fear had forged an unexpected unity. The terraformers intensified their efforts from orbit, redirecting energy beams to stabilize air currents and break apart the storm's most dangerous spirals. Their floating machines became glowing beacons in the dark sky, drawing some of the wind's fury away from settlements. Coordinated atmospheric adjustments caused shockwaves that echoed through the storm like distant thunderclaps. For settlers on the ground, seeing these machines working in harmony with their own efforts sparked a new sense of connection. The terraformers were no longer distant overseers, but active partners in their survival. Humanity above and below was finally working as one species. It was a rare moment where technological might and human courage intertwined seamlessly. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion set in. Shelters shook, power grids faltered, and water seeped through cracks, but the defenses held longer than anyone expected. Teams rotated through shifts, repairing and reinforcing without pause. Underground engineers worked side by side with surface technicians via emergency channels, their skills complementing each other perfectly. Terraformers fed atmospheric data into these networks, giving early warnings that saved countless lives. Despite the fury outside, there was an unspoken rhythm, a shared determination that bound everyone together. In the heart of the storm, humanity rediscovered its collective strength. When dawn finally broke, the storm began to weaken. The clouds thinned, revealing the first rays of sunlight breaking through like blades of gold. Settlers emerged cautiously, stepping into a landscape reshaped by wind and rain. Trees bent but did not break. Shelters stood where cities once crumbled, and the processors hummed steadily above. Flooded fields shimmered with morning light, reflecting a sky that now felt both powerful and sacred. People stared upward, exhausted but alive, realizing they had endured something monumental. The storm had not destroyed them. It had tested them. In the aftermath, rescue teams spread out across the settlements. Outposts that had gone silent were reached, survivors pulled from collapsed structures, and damaged equipment salvaged for repair. Casualties were mourned, but the number was far lower than anyone had feared. People shared supplies freely, without the hesitation of old divisions. Underground citizens sent fresh resources topside, while terraformers deployed repair drones to patch critical damage. The response was swift, coordinated, and compassionate. What had begun as a disaster ended as a moment of unprecedented solidarity. The Council of Nuvia convened with surface leaders and terraformers for the first joint summit since terraforming began. No longer could they deny the interdependence of their worlds. The storm had proven that survival required cooperation, not separation. Voices that once argued fiercely now spoke with mutual respect, acknowledging shared responsibility for their reborn planet. Plans were made to establish permanent communication, and resource networks between underground and surface communities. Terraformers offered deeper integration, but this time humanity approached as equals, not dependents. The old world had fractured, the new one was being built together. As night fell, the stars emerged in a sky scrubbed clean by the storm's might. Settlers gathered outside, their faces lit by fires and starlight, reflecting on what they had endured. The storm had been brutal, but it had united people in ways no treaty ever could. Old fears had been shaken loose, replaced by a collective understanding of what it meant to share a world. The sky no longer belonged to one group, one ideology, or one history. It belonged to everyone who had faced its wrath and stood together. In that quiet, star-filled night, humanity took its first true step toward becoming one again. The storm had not just changed the landscape, it had changed them. In the months following the Great Storm, the world above began to change in visible, meaningful ways. Settlements that had been temporary camps evolved into permanent towns, their structures blending advanced technology with the raw materials of the restored planet. Wind turbines rose alongside budding trees, while solar panels stretched across fields that now sprouted real crops. The air grew cleaner, more stable, and the storms became seasonal rather than chaotic. People worked with a newfound rhythm, guided by both orbital forecasts and natural signs, relearning the language of weather their ancestors had once known by heart. Children born after the storm would never remember the underground ceilings. They would grow up beneath real skies. The transformation from survival to civilization had quietly begun. On the surface, communities flourished as cooperation replaced fragmentation. Scientists, farmers, builders, and terraformers formed joint councils to decide how to balance human expansion with ecological restoration. It was no longer a question of choosing between nature and progress, but of weaving them together. Circular cities grew outward, surrounded by green belts designed to nurture both human and wildlife habitats. Rivers were redirected thoughtfully, not conquered, feeding both farmland and rewilded zones. Technology served the planet instead of dominating it, a shift that reflected hard lessons learned through struggle. This was not the old civilization reborn, it was something entirely new. Underground change came more slowly but inevitably. The Council, once an unchallenged authority, adapted to a new role as guardians of history and infrastructure rather than rulers. Many citizens who had once feared the surface began to visit regularly, their first trips guided by surface settlers eager to share what they had built. Some chose to remain below, preserving the subterranean world as a living archive, while others joined the migration permanently. Trade routes between surface towns and underground hubs became established, carrying resources, tools, and knowledge both ways. What had once been a division was now a network. The old world and the new were learning to coexist. The terraformers, whose presence had once seemed distant and enigmatic, became integrated partners in daily life. While they remained primarily in orbit, their drones and communication channels were constant fixtures of surface development. They provided guidance on maintaining atmospheric stability, managing environmental shifts, and preserving the delicate ecosystems they had seeded. Yet, they refrained from imposing any cultural or political structures, allowing humanity to shape its destiny. Many settlers began to see them less as saviors and more as collaborators. A quiet respect formed between those in the sky and those on the ground. It was a partnership built on mutual survival and shared vision. Culturally, the rebirth of the surface sparked a renaissance. Artists painted skies in ways their ancestors could only imagine, capturing sunsets and storms with reverence. Storytellers retold ancient myths about the sky, blending them with the real experiences of the new generation. Music drifted through towns at night, carried by winds that once howled with poison. Festivals emerged to celebrate seasonal changes, solstices and harvests, reconnecting people with natural rhythms. Underground traditions also found their place, preserved in archives and reimagined in open-air theaters. For the first time in centuries, humanity was creating culture shaped by both earth and sky. The divide between old and new became a tapestry rather than a tier. Education transformed in remarkable ways. Schools taught both the technological intricacies of terraforming and the ecological wisdom of living within planetary boundaries. Children studied star maps alongside wind patterns, learning to navigate both the cosmos and the natural world. Lessons were no longer confined to underground chambers, but held in open fields, forests, and observatories. Knowledge that had once been fragmented between survivalist engineering and forgotten history now flowed together. Elders shared oral histories, while scientists explained atmospheric dynamics, bridging centuries of lost understanding. The next generation grew up fluent in both worlds. They were the first true children of the restored sky. Governance evolved into something unprecedented. Instead of centralized rule, surface councils, underground communities, and orbital terraformers formed a cooperative triad. Decisions were made through layered assemblies that valued expertise, community voice, and environmental stewardship equally. It was not a flawless system, but it was resilient and adaptive, qualities their civilization desperately needed. Disputes were resolved not by force, but through shared responsibility, with the storm still fresh in collective memory as a reminder of their fragility. No single faction dominated. Power was balanced between Earth, sky, and stars. Humanity was building a political structure as dynamic as the world they inhabited. The environment continued to heal at a remarkable pace. Forests expanded where ruins once stood. Rivers carved new paths, and engineered species integrated seamlessly with natural regrowth. Some of the most damaged regions remained restricted, monitored by scientists as nature reclaimed them slowly. Atmospheric processes were gradually decommissioned as the planet became self-sustaining. Terraformers declared their primary mission complete, but remained as guardians and allies. What had once been a desperate project of survival had become a living, thriving world again. The sky no longer needed to be fixed. It needed to be shared. People began to travel beyond their settlements, exploring the vast stretches of land that had been unreachable for centuries. Expeditions mapped mountain ranges, rediscovered ancient coastlines, and documented wildlife returning in unexpected ways. Old ruins were transformed into memorials and learning centers, honoring those who had endured the underground centuries. Communities established pathways and networks across continents, not to conquer but to connect. Travel under the open sky became a rite of passage for young people, a way to understand both their history and their place in a living world. For the first time in generations, humanity saw itself as part of something larger than survival. Exploration had become celebration. As the first generation born entirely under the restored sky reached adulthood, they inherited a world profoundly different from the one their ancestors had buried themselves in. They grew up not fearing the sky but revering it, not fleeing nature but protecting it. Their world was still imperfect, with challenges that would continue for centuries, but it was alive, breathing, and shared. Underground, surface, and orbit had become three layers of a single civilization. The forgotten sky was no longer forgotten. It had become the heart of human existence once again. And from that heart, a new era began. Generations passed, and the memory of darkness became something spoken of in classrooms rather than experienced firsthand. The sky, once myth and then miracle, became as ordinary as it was essential. Children grew up under stars their ancestors had not seen for centuries, learning to navigate by constellations and seasonal winds. They listened to stories of the underground cities, as one might hear legends of distant kingdoms. The world had not merely recovered, it had matured into a living organism shared by humans and the environment in harmony. Terraformers, once distant figures, were now historical allies remembered in festivals and songs. Humanity had entered an era of quiet confidence, rooted in the lessons of its own past. Cities on the surface expanded thoughtfully, guided by ecological balance rather than endless consumption. Skyscrapers of steel and glass were replaced by living structures woven from advanced biomaterials and adaptive systems. Energy grids flowed seamlessly from solar fields, wind turbines, and geothermal reservoirs, making power a shared and sustainable resource. Transportation relied on atmospheric gliders and ground vehicles that left no scars upon the earth. Rivers were no longer dammed but guided. Forests no longer cleared but cultivated alongside human communities. Nature and civilization no longer competed. They danced. It was a future built not on domination, but on understanding. Underground cities, though no longer centers of power, remained vital cultural and historical hubs. Generations born on the surface visited them like living museums, walking the halls their ancestors had once called home. These spaces were preserved with reverence, not nostalgia, maintained as a reminder of humanity's resilience in the face of extinction. Some families chose to keep their roots below, creating hybrid communities that moved between surface and underground with ease. Trade, education, and cultural exchange flowed in both directions, weaving their histories tightly together. The once impenetrable barrier between above and below was now a bridge. Terraformers continued to orbit the planet, but their role evolved over time. No longer did they need to intervene to stabilize the atmosphere. The planet had regained its natural rhythms. Instead, they served as cosmic observers and protectors, ensuring that humanity did not repeat the mistakes that had once driven them underground. Their vast knowledge of stars and planetary systems became part of humanity's educational fabric, inspiring new generations to look upward with ambition, not fear. Young students watched their ships trace slow arcs across the night sky, like guardians of an ancient promise. The relationship between Earth and orbit matured into partnership rather than dependency. New technologies emerged that harmonized with the environment instead of overwhelming it. Materials were designed to decompose naturally, energy systems adapted to weather patterns, and architecture adjusted dynamically to its surroundings. Artificial intelligence worked as unseen custodians, monitoring ecosystems and infrastructure in tandem. Innovation was not abandoned. It was redirected toward balance. The culture of terraform and control shifted to listen and adapt, marking a philosophical turning point. Humanity had grown wiser, blending the precision of technology with the patience of nature. It was a civilization learning not just to survive, but to endure. Culturally, humanity flourished in ways their underground ancestors could not have imagined. Music carried the sound of winds and birds. Languages developed new words for skies and stars long forgotten. Literature explored the vast landscapes above, celebrating the unity between human spirit and planetary renewal. Artistic movements emerged that honored the cycles of nature, blending ancient myths with modern science. Seasonal festivals marked astronomical events, weaving human stories into cosmic timelines. Underground traditions remained alive, integrated into surface life as treasured heritage rather than relics. This fusion created a cultural tapestry unlike any in history. Education became a cornerstone of this civilization's strength. Every child learned the history of the Great Fall, the long exile underground, and the rebirth through terraforming. But they also learned astronomy, ecology, and the delicate mechanisms that kept their world alive. Schools functioned not only as places of knowledge, but as gardens, laboratories, and observatories. Learning was inseparable from living, ensuring that no generation would grow disconnected from the planet or the sky again. The story of their ancestors' mistakes was not erased. It was taught, remembered, and respected. Wisdom became their inheritance. Eventually, humanity began to look outward again, not out of desperation, but out of curiosity. With their world thriving, exploration of nearby star systems resumed, this time with a very different purpose. No longer were they searching for escape. They sought connection. Terraformers, now part of human culture, led joint expeditions to observe other worlds, not to conquer them, but to learn from their diversity. Starships left the atmosphere under skies clear and stable, cheered on by generations who understood the weight of such journeys. The cosmos was no longer a refuge. It was a shared frontier. Humanity carried with it the lessons of its rebirth. Centuries later, the story of those who had once forgotten the sky was told across planets and stations. It was remembered not as a tale of shame, but as a testament to resilience and transformation. The underground years became a symbol of endurance, the terraforming era a symbol of renewal, and the Great Storm a symbol of unity. These stories were told around fires, in classrooms, in orbiting stations, and on distant colonies. They reminded every generation that the sky is not a gift to be taken for granted, but a responsibility to uphold. Civilization had expanded beyond its homeworld, but its heart remained tied to that first restored sky. The memory had become eternal. As the stars stretched overhead and humanity walked among them once again, their relationship with their home world remained unbroken. Every colony, every ship, carried seeds from the forests, air samples from the restored atmosphere, and cultural relics born from those first days under the sun. The sky that had once been lost was now shared across worlds, a living bond between planets and people. No matter how far they traveled, the story began with a people who had once forgotten the light. They had endured darkness, rebuilt their world, and learned to live in harmony with it. In every breath, in every gaze at the stars, that legacy lived on. Humanity had not only reclaimed the sky, they had become its stewards. Millennia passed, and humanity's presence stretched across star systems, yet their collective memory remained anchored to the era when they rediscovered the sky. On distant worlds orbiting unfamiliar suns, settlers built observatories. where the story of their homeworld's rebirth was recited as a sacred rite. The tale was no longer just history, it had become the foundation of their cultural identity. Children grew up knowing that their ancestors had once lived without the sky, then chosen to reclaim it with courage and patience. It became a story of humility, reminding even the most advanced civilizations that survival required balance, not domination. As human societies evolved, the memory of the sky became their moral compass. It was both a legend and a lesson, passed through generations like a flame. Rituals honoring the first sky became universal across colonies. Every year, under their local stars, communities paused their daily lives to look upward together. The silence during these moments carried a weight older than any single world, linking billions across light years in a shared reflection. People recited passages from ancient accounts of the storm, the terraforming, and the moment when the first explorers opened the hatch to sunlight. These rituals were neither religious nor purely historical. They were something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement of their collective rebirth. Colonies with no atmospheric ceiling simulated sky through massive domes, ensuring the tradition endured even in artificial environments. The sky had become more than air and stars. It had become humanity's shared symbol. As technology advanced beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined, the temptation to forget grew stronger. Automation handled climate regulation, habitats were self-sustaining, and entire cities floated among clouds on gas giants. For some, the idea that their species had once nearly lost its homeworld felt like distant myth. But storytellers, historians, and philosophers worked tirelessly to keep the memory alive. Through immersive chronicles and generational education, they ensured that no child would grow up ignorant of the fragile balance that defined their civilization's origins. Forgetting, they warned, was the first step toward repeating. The sky story remained their anchor. Philosophers began to speak of the sky within, a concept that transcended physical worlds. It was the belief that every human carried the memory of light and openness inside them, no matter how distant from their ancestral home they traveled. This idea shaped spiritual movements that didn't worship stars, but reflected on the human journey itself. Temples were built not for gods, but for sky viewing, constructed on asteroids, moons, and orbital stations where silence and vastness met. Travelers would pause their journeys to look out at the cosmos and remember their beginning beneath a single blue sky. It was a philosophy of remembrance, resilience, and responsibility. It connected scattered worlds into one people. Over time, new myths emerged, blending fact and imagination. The Great Storm became a tale of the sky's trial, a test to see if humanity was worthy of the light. The terraformers were remembered as the watchers above, guiding without ruling, teaching without taking. Underground dwellers became the keepers of the deep, those who preserved knowledge through the long night. These myths were not replacements for history, but poetic expansions of it, helping future generations internalize their legacy emotionally as well as intellectually. Even in the farthest reaches of space, these stories inspired art, song, and architecture. Humanity's identity had become inseparable from its rediscovery of the sky. Millennia of peace did not mean the absence of struggle. Civilizations rose and fell on distant worlds, facing challenges their ancestors could not have foreseen. Yet each time, communities turned to the sky story for guidance. It reminded them of adaptability, unity, and humility before forces larger than themselves. Leaders invoked the lessons of the forgotten sky in speeches, laws, and treaties, grounding their choices in the shared past. In times of conflict, colonies sent envoys to sky-viewing temples, negotiating under the stars as a reminder of their origins. The sky, even light years away, was their meeting ground. Artists across eras reinterpreted the story in endless forms. Vast murals depicted the moment the hatch opened, bathed in light. Operas and epics retold the storm as a symphony of chaos and rebirth. Holographic installations recreated the sensation of stepping into sunlight for the first time, immersing viewers in their ancestors' awe. Writers explored the philosophical weight of remembering the sky while walking among alien constellations. Sculptors carved spirals and arches into cities, designed to draw every gaze upward. Creativity ensured that the story was not static but alive, evolving with every generation. The sky was not just remembered, it was constantly reimagined. Education across the stars placed the sky story at its core. It was taught alongside mathematics, language, and ethics, not as propaganda, but as shared heritage. Students studied ancient environmental data, historical records and cultural texts from the terraforming era. They debated its moral lessons, questioning how future civilizations should avoid repeating old patterns. Some went on pilgrimages to the restored homeworld, standing beneath its blue sky as a rite of passage. Others visited orbital museums that preserved the original atmospheric processes, now silent monuments to human perseverance. Knowledge became both intellectual and experiential, ensuring the legacy endured through mind and heart alike. Eventually, contact was made with other intelligent species, each with their own histories, triumphs, and mistakes. Humanity shared the sky story not as a tale of superiority, but as a testament to what it meant to rediscover harmony. Alien civilizations listened with fascination, recognizing in it echoes of their own struggles. The story became a bridge, fostering mutual respect and philosophical exchange. Across languages and cultures, the image of a people stepping from darkness into light resonated universally. It was no longer just humanity's myth. It became part of a galactic narrative about survival and renewal. The sky had transcended species, and so beneath alien suns and among distant stars, the memory of the forgotten sky remained unbroken. It endured through technology, philosophy, myth, and art, binding generations who would never set foot on the original world. The sky was no longer just something above, it was something within, a shared origin that guided civilizations through time. Even as galaxies turned and empires rose and fell, the story persisted like constellations that outlived the stars themselves. Humanity had not only reclaimed the sky, they had turned it into their most enduring legacy. In remembering the sky, they remembered themselves, and in that remembrance, they never lost their way again.